The Japanese intelligence officer sat in his cramped office in Tokyo, holding a reconnaissance photograph that made no sense. The image showed what appeared to be a massive aircraft carrier, not floating in water where it belonged, but nestled deep inside a mountain in the American heartland. He blinked hard and looked again, certain his eyes were deceiving him, but the photograph remained unchanged. There, in the landlocked state of Nebraska, thousands of miles from any ocean, sat what looked unmistakably like the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, surrounded by prairie grass and cornfields instead of waves. His hand trembled slightly as he passed the photograph to his superior, knowing that what he was seeing violated every assumption about warfare, about geography, about what was possible. This was not a trick of light or a mistake in translation. This was real. America had built aircraft carriers inside mountains, far from the vulnerable coasts where Japanese submarines prowled and bombers might reach. The concept seemed to defy logic itself. How could a ship exist without water? How could pilots train for naval warfare in places where the nearest ocean was 1,000 miles away? Yet there they were, in the photographs and intelligence reports that kept arriving throughout the war. Massive mock-up carriers constructed in the most unexpected places across America's vast interior. And the Japanese High Command, even as they planned their attacks on Pearl Harbor and dreamed of crippling America's Pacific Fleet, had no idea that deep in America's heartland, far beyond their reach, the enemy was preparing a response they could never have imagined. The story began not with deception, but with desperation. After the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America's Pacific carrier fleet lay in ruins. The Arizona burned. The Oklahoma capsized. The Nevada beached herself to avoid sinking in the channel. Thousands of sailors died in minutes, and the pride of the American Navy smoldered in the Hawaiian morning Sunday. Japan had struck a blow designed to cripple American naval power for years, perhaps permanently. Their carriers had launched their planes with precision, achieved complete surprise, and returned home victorious. In Tokyo, military planners congratulated themselves on a perfectly executed operation. They had bought themselves time, they believed, perhaps a year or more before America could mount any serious carrier-based response. They had seen the smoke rising from Pearl Harbor, had counted the ships destroyed, and had done their mathematics. Aircraft carriers took years to build, required massive industrial facilities, and depended on skilled workers who needed extensive training. America would need to start from nothing, they calculated, and by the time new carriers slid down the shipways, Japan would control the entire Pacific. But Japan had made a fundamental miscalculation about America that went far beyond counting ships and sailors. They had failed to understand the nature of American industrial power, the vast spaces of American geography, and most critically, the American capacity for improvisation. While Japanese planners saw warfare as something conducted according to established rules and traditions, Americans viewed problems as puzzles to be solved through ingenuity and sheer audacity. And so, even as Pearl Harbor still smoldered, American military planners were already asking a question that would have seemed absurd to their Japanese counterparts. If we don't have enough real aircraft carriers, and we can't build new ones fast enough, what if we simply built fake ones instead? Not to fool the enemy at sea, but to train our pilots on land, far from any shoreline where enemy submarines or bombers might reach them. The idea emerged from multiple places almost simultaneously, as good ideas often do in times of crisis. Navy training officers realized that new pilots needed to practice carrier landings somewhere safe before attempting them on actual ships at sea. Carrier landings were among the most dangerous maneuvers in all of aviation. A pilot had to approach a moving platform that was pitching and rolling with the waves, catch an arresting wire with a tailhook while traveling over 100 miles per hour, and do so with precision measured in feet and seconds. Mistakes meant crashing into the sea or the carrier's superstructure, often with fatal results. Before the war, pilots trained on the carriers themselves, landing again and again until muscle memory took over and they could do it instinctively. But now those carriers were desperately needed in combat, not sitting near training bases while student pilots practiced. Someone, somewhere in the vast American military bureaucracy, asked the logical question: what if we simply painted a carrier flight deck on solid ground and let them practice there? From that simple question emerged one of the most unusual military construction projects in history. Across America's interior, far from the coasts, massive mock-up aircraft carriers began to appear in places where no ship had any business being. In Glenview, Illinois, just north of Chicago, workers constructed a detailed replica of a carrier deck complete with island superstructure and arresting gear. In Traverse City, Michigan, on the shores of Lake Michigan, another appeared. In the farmland of Indiana, the plains of Kansas, the fields of Pennsylvania, these strange hybrid structures rose from the earth. They were not ships, exactly, because they sat on land and would never float. But they were not buildings either, because they replicated every detail of a carrier's flight deck with obsessive accuracy. They existed in a category of their own, these land-based ships, these carriers that would never touch water. The construction crews who built them worked with an urgency born of wartime desperation. They poured concrete foundations to create perfectly level surfaces that matched carrier deck dimensions exactly. They installed functioning arresting gear, the system of cables and hydraulics that caught a landing plane's tailhook and brought it to a controlled stop. They built full-scale replicas of carrier island superstructures, complete with the bridge, radio equipment, and flight control stations. They even painted the decks with the same layout patterns used on real carriers, the white lines and colored markers that guided pilots during operations. From above, from the perspective of a pilot approaching for landing, these structures looked remarkably like the real thing. The illusion needed to be perfect because training worked only if the brain could not tell the difference between practice and reality. The most ambitious of these installations appeared at the Naval Air Station in Glenview. There, engineers constructed what amounted to an entire carrier that happened to sit on land instead of water. The flight deck stretched the full length of an Essex-class carrier, over 800 feet long. Hydraulic platforms could be raised and lowered to simulate the pitching and rolling of a ship at sea. The arresting gear functioned identically to shipboard systems, requiring pilots to execute perfect landings or face realistic consequences. Around the perimeter, safety nets caught planes that missed the deck, just as they would on a real carrier. Standing on the grass beside this massive structure, looking up at the gray-painted flight deck towering overhead, the strangeness of it struck observers forcefully. This was a ship that grew from the earth, like some bizarre industrial crop, anchored not by water, but by the flat Illinois prairie. And the Japanese, watching America from across the Pacific through whatever intelligence they could gather, found themselves confronting photographs and reports that challenged their understanding of what was possible. Their reconnaissance efforts, limited as they were, occasionally produced images of these installations. Analysts in Tokyo looked at photographs of carrier decks surrounded by farmland and forests, and they struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. Some initially dismissed the images as American trickery, perhaps cardboard mock-ups designed to draw Japanese bombers to worthless targets. Others wondered if Americans had somehow developed technology to move carriers overland, though this seemed to violate basic physics. The truth, that America was training thousands of carrier pilots simultaneously at facilities deep in the heartland, far beyond Japanese reach, took time to sink in. And when it did sink in, it revealed something more troubling than any tactical surprise. It showed that America fought with a different mindset entirely, unbound by convention, willing to build ships on land if that was what victory required. Young American pilots arrived at these strange installations with their own sense of disorientation. Most had grown up in small towns and rural areas, had never seen the ocean, could hardly imagine what it meant to land on a ship at sea. They stepped off buses and trains, reported for duty, and found themselves staring at carrier decks that rose improbably from familiar American landscapes. A pilot from Kansas might look at the Glenview installation and see something that belonged in the Pacific somehow transported to the Midwest, a piece of naval warfare grafted onto the continental interior. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and intentional. These young men needed to shed their land-bound thinking, needed to become naval aviators in their bones, and the mock carriers served as the threshold between their old lives and their new ones. Their training began with lectures and simulations, but quickly progressed to actual landings. An instructor would explain the approach pattern, the speed requirements, the exact moment to cut throttle and drop for the deck. The pilot would climb into his plane, often a Snide Texan or similar trainer aircraft, and taxi out to the runway. He would take off, circle the field, and then begin his approach to the mock carrier deck. From the air, the illusion became complete. The rectangular outline of the flight deck appeared below, the island structure rising on one side, the landing area marked with white lines. The pilot would line up his approach, watching his altitude and airspeed with intense concentration, knowing that the landing signal officer stood on the deck below, watching his every move with flags in hand. Too high, too low, too fast, too slow, and the officer would wave him off, forcing him to circle and try again. But if everything aligned, if his speed and altitude and angle all came together perfectly, the officer would give him the cut signal, and the pilot would chop his throttle and drop toward the deck. The impact, when it came, felt shockingly violent. The plane's tailhook caught one of the arresting cables stretched across the deck, and the pilot slammed forward against his harness as the plane went from flight speed to dead stop in less than 2 seconds. The deceleration generated forces that pushed the limits of human tolerance, pressed the pilot back into his seat, made his vision narrow, and his chest compress. And then, suddenly, it was over. The plane sat motionless on the deck, engine idling, tailhook still engaged with the cable. The pilot would raise his hook, receive taxi signals from deck crew, and move forward to clear the landing area for the next plane. He would taxi back to the starting position, take off again, and repeat the process. Again and again and again, until the motion became automatic, until his hands and feet worked the controls without conscious thought, until he could land on that narrow deck in any weather, any time of day or night, no matter how exhausted or frightened he might feel. But landing on solid ground, however realistic the deck mock-up, was still not quite the same as landing on a ship that moved with the ocean swells. And so the Navy, in yet another display of the American genius for improvisation, took the concept one step further. On Lake Michigan, far from enemy submarines or surface raiders, the Navy converted 2 sidewheel passenger steamers into training carriers. The USS Wolverine and USS Sable, their names deliberately chosen to sound landlocked and unthreatening, began operations in 1943. These were not combat carriers. They had no armor, no defensive weapons, no capacity to support military operations. They were simply mobile flight decks, platforms from which pilots could practice actual carrier landings on actual moving vessels, all while remaining safely in American inland waters. The conversion was crude by combat standards. The paddle wheels remained visible on either side of the hull, an anachronistic throwback to 19th century riverboats. The flight decks were wooden, functional, but nothing more. Yet they served their purpose perfectly, providing the final step in carrier qualification for thousands of pilots. The operations on Lake Michigan became legendary among naval aviators. Pilots would take off from shore bases, fly out over the lake's cold gray waters, and find the Wolverine or Sable steaming in circles through the waves. They would radio for permission to land, receive their approach instructions, and then commit themselves to the terrifying ballet of a carrier landing. The margin for error was razor thin. Too much power, and they would overshoot the deck, crash into the barrier nets, and risk sliding into the lake. Too little power, and they would drop short, hit the stern of the ship, and cartwheel into the water. The lake itself was unforgiving, particularly in winter when ice formed along the shoreline and water temperatures dropped to levels that gave a man only minutes of consciousness if he went in. Support boats followed the carriers, ready to rescue pilots who missed the deck and ended up in the water. But everyone knew that rescue was not guaranteed. Over the course of the war, more than 100 aircraft would slide off these decks and sink to the bottom of Lake Michigan, taking some pilots with them. The lake kept these planes, preserved them in its cold, fresh water, buried them in the mud at depths where they would not be found for decades. And yet, despite the risks, the system worked brilliantly. By bringing carrier training to America's interior, the Navy had solved multiple problems simultaneously. Pilots could train in safety, far from enemy attack. Valuable combat carriers remained free for frontline operations instead of being tied up in training duties. And the sheer scale of the operation meant that America could produce carrier-qualified pilots at a rate Japan could never match. By 1943, hundreds of pilots were qualifying on Lake Michigan every month. They would land successfully on the Wolverine or Sable, receive their certification, and then ship out to combat carriers in the Pacific. Some would arrive at Pearl Harbor and find themselves assigned to brand new Essex-class carriers that were rolling off American shipyards with stunning speed. Others would join older carriers that had survived Pearl Harbor or the desperate battles of 1942. But all of them arrived with skills honed on these strange inland training platforms, ships that never touched salt water, carriers that hid inside America's vast interior spaces. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced very different realities in their own training pipeline. Japan's geography offered no equivalent to America's vast interior spaces. The home islands sat exposed in the Pacific, surrounded by water but lacking the strategic depth that inland training bases provided. Japanese carrier pilots trained on the carriers themselves, or at coastal bases vulnerable to eventual American attack. More critically, Japan's industrial capacity and population could not sustain the losses that carrier warfare demanded. Each experienced pilot represented years of training and could not be easily replaced. The Japanese training system produced excellent aviators, perhaps initially superior to their American counterparts in skill and experience, but it produced them slowly, in limited numbers, and could not replace losses at anything approaching the rate America achieved with its decentralized training network. A Japanese pilot shot down over the Pacific represented an irreplaceable loss of expertise. An American pilot, trained on one of the inland mock carriers, could be replaced by another fresh graduate within weeks. This asymmetry in training capacity would prove as decisive as any battle. After the catastrophic Japanese losses at Midway in June 1942, where 4 Japanese carriers went to the bottom along with hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and crew, Japan never fully recovered its naval aviation capability. The carriers could theoretically be replaced, though slowly. The pilots could not. America, meanwhile, was just beginning to hit its stride. The training facilities in places like Glenview and on Lake Michigan were reaching full operational capacity. New pilots were qualifying at an accelerating rate, and behind them, in shipyards from Brooklyn to San Francisco, new carriers were under construction using prefabrication techniques and mass production methods that would have seemed impossible before the war. America was preparing to flood the Pacific with carriers and carrier-qualified pilots in numbers that would simply overwhelm Japanese defenses through sheer volume. The irony would not have been lost on the Japanese officers who saw those reconnaissance photographs of carrier decks in Nebraska and Illinois. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor partly out of fear that America's industrial potential would eventually become unstoppable once fully mobilized. The attack was meant to buy time, to cripple American naval power before it could be brought to bear. But in attacking, Japan had awakened exactly the industrial and logistical genius it feared most. The mock carriers, the lake conversions, the mass training of pilots deep in America's interior, all of this represented American power at its most characteristic. Not the formal traditional power of established military might, but the improvisational, industrial, democratic power of a continental nation that could throw vast resources at unconventional solutions and make them work through determination and sheer scale. And there was something deeply American in the very existence of these installations, something that spoke to the nation's character and its approach to problems. Americans had always been people of the interior as much as the coasts, farmers and miners and railroad workers who thought continentally rather than maritally. The idea of bringing naval warfare inland, of practicing ocean operations on the Great Lakes and the prairie, fit perfectly with this tradition of ignoring boundaries between categories. If you needed to train pilots and didn't have enough carriers, you built carriers on land. If you needed water for practice and the oceans were too dangerous, you used a lake. The solution might look absurd from a traditional perspective, might violate the established categories that said ships belonged on oceans and warfare followed predictable patterns. But Americans had never much cared for established categories. They cared about results. The pilots who trained at these facilities carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Many would later recall the strangeness of those first landings, the disconnect between the prairie landscape scrolling past beneath their wings and the carrier deck rising to meet them. Some remembered the cold winds that blew across Lake Michigan in winter, the ice that formed on their windscreens during approach, the white-capped waves that made the Wolverine and Sable pitch and roll like combat carriers in the Pacific. Others remembered the camaraderie of the training bases, the evenings in officers' clubs discussing technique in close calls, the shared anxiety of waiting for weather to clear so they could get their required landing practice. For all of them, these inland carriers served as the gateway to a war they could hardly imagine when they first reported for training. Young men from Iowa and Ohio and Georgia found themselves learning to operate in an environment none of them had grown up understanding, the strange world of carrier aviation where nothing stayed still and error meant death. Some of them would not survive their training. The accidents on Lake Michigan claimed lives, as did crashes at the land-based facilities. Learning to land on a carrier was dangerous under the best circumstances, and even practice could be fatal. But those who succeeded, who qualified and received their wings and their orders to the Pacific, carried with them skills that had been literally forged in the American heartland. They represented a kind of pilot that had not existed before the war, mass-produced aviators trained on industrial scales at facilities that treated carrier qualification as a manufacturing process rather than an elite tradition. They were not necessarily better individual pilots than their Japanese opponents, particularly early in the war, but they came in numbers that Japan could never match, and behind them came more and more, a seemingly endless stream of young men from small towns and big cities who had learned to land on carrier decks that grew from Illinois cornfields and Indiana farmland. By late 1943 and into 1944, the results of this training pipeline became visible in the Pacific. American carriers, the new Essex-class ships, and the converted cruisers of the Independence class began appearing in increasing numbers. Each one carried a full air group of pilots who had qualified on Lake Michigan or Glenview, or one of the other training facilities. These pilots arrived ready to operate, not needing to learn the basics of carrier work while also learning combat. They could land in difficult conditions, could operate at night, could handle the stress and pressure of flight operations because they had done it hundreds of times before they ever saw combat. The Japanese, facing these growing American forces with depleted air groups and irreplaceable losses mounting with each battle, found themselves overwhelmed not by superior technology or tactics, but by simple numbers. America could afford to lose pilots and replace them quickly. Japan could not, and that difference, more than any single battle or campaign, determined the outcome of the carrier war in the Pacific. The mock carriers themselves, strange as they were, represented something larger than their immediate military purpose. They were physical manifestations of American industrial creativity, examples of lateral thinking applied to warfare. The traditional approach to training carrier pilots was to use carriers. America, not having enough carriers, simply built substitutes that served the same function without requiring actual ships. This willingness to question assumptions, to reject the idea that things had to be done the way they had always been done, ran through the entire American war effort. If you needed landing craft and didn't have proper facilities to build them, you contracted with small boat yards and manufactured them in sections. If you needed cargo capacity and didn't have enough cargo ships, You designed standardized Liberty ships that could be built in weeks rather than months. If you needed carrier pilots and didn't have enough carriers, you built carrier decks on land. Every problem had a solution if you were willing to think creatively and accept unconventional answers. For the Japanese intelligence officers who tried to understand what they were seeing in those reconnaissance photographs, this American approach to warfare must have been profoundly disorienting. Japanese military culture emphasized tradition, hierarchy, established methods proven over time. There was a right way to do things, a proper form to follow. Americans seemed to have no such inhibitions. They would try anything, build anything, improvise any solution that might work. This made American actions unpredictable, difficult to anticipate, hard to counter. How did you plan against an enemy who might decide to build ships on land simply because it solved a training problem? How did you calculate their production capacity when they were willing to convert passenger steamers into training carriers and operate them on an inland lake? The variables became impossible to control, the permutations endless. And there was a democratic element to this as well, something that distinguished American from Japanese training methods in a fundamental way. The American system, with its multiple training facilities and standardized procedures, was designed to take ordinary young men and turn them into carrier pilots as efficiently as possible. It was a process meant to work at scale, to handle thousands of trainees simultaneously. Japan's system, by contrast, was more selective, more focused on identifying and nurturing exceptional individuals who would become elite aviators. The American approach was inherently more democratic, assuming that with proper training most reasonably talented pilots could learn carrier operations. The Japanese approach was more aristocratic, seeking the naturally gifted and investing heavily in their development. Early in the war, the Japanese system produced superior individual pilots, but as the war dragged on and losses mounted, the American system's ability to produce adequate pilots in huge numbers proved far more valuable than Japan's ability to produce excellent pilots in small numbers. The young pilots themselves rarely thought about these larger strategic implications. They focused on the immediate challenge of landing on the deck, of catching the wire, of surviving their training and moving on to combat. But in their aggregate, in their thousands, they represented American power in its most effective form. They were the product of a vast industrial and training system that could take raw human material and process it into skilled aviators with assembly line efficiency. Each one was replaceable, not because he was unimportant as an individual, but because the system could produce another to take his place. This was the kind of power that won long wars, not through brilliance or heroism, though those played their part, but through sheer sustainable capability, the ability to keep producing and replacing and expanding while the enemy's resources steadily diminished. After the war ended, many of these facilities simply faded away. The mock carrier at Glenview was eventually dismantled, the concrete broken up, the arresting gear removed. The Wolverine and Sable were decommissioned and sold for scrap, their brief lives as training carriers ending with the peace. The pilots who had trained there scattered across the country, returning to civilian life, carrying memories of those strange days when they learned to land on ships that sat on land or steamed through a lake thousands of miles from any ocean. Some would gather years later at reunions, would share stories about close calls and successful qualifications, would remember friends who did not make it through training. They would talk about the strangeness of it, the disconnect of practicing naval warfare in places like Illinois and Michigan, surrounded by farmland and forests rather than open ocean. The planes that sank in Lake Michigan during training operations remained on the bottom, preserved by the cold, fresh water, slowly being covered by sediment. Decades later, some would be recovered, raised from the depths and restored, museum pieces that testified to the scope of the training operation. Each recovered aircraft told a story of a pilot who missed a landing, who went into the water, who hopefully was rescued but in some cases was not. They were casualties of training, losses incurred not in combat but in preparation for combat. reminders that even practice could be deadly when it involved machines and speeds and forces that operated at the margins of human capability. For Japan, the revelation of America's inland training operations came too late to change strategy or adjust plans. By the time they fully understood what America was doing, the momentum of the war had already shifted decisively. The carriers and pilots that had been trained at these facilities were already operating in the Pacific, pushing Japanese forces back across the ocean, island by island, battle by battle. The mock carriers had done their job, had produced the aviators needed to man the real carriers, had solved the training bottleneck that might otherwise have limited American naval expansion. They had been a strange solution to a difficult problem, these ships that grew from land, these carriers that hid inside America's heartland. But they had worked, and in war, what worked was all that mattered. There is something haunting about the idea of those carrier decks appearing in the American interior, those massive structures rising from prairie and lakeside, teaching young men from landlocked states how to operate in an ocean environment they had never seen. They represented a moment when war demanded such total mobilization that even the fundamental categories of land and sea began to blur. They showed what a nation could accomplish when it committed fully to a goal, when it was willing to think beyond convention and improvise solutions on continental scales. They were temporary, most of them built for war and dismantled in peace, leaving little permanent trace. But for the years they existed, they were gateways through which thousands of young Americans passed on their way to a war that would reshape the world. And they remain a testament to the American capacity for practical creativity, for solving problems through audacity and scale, for building carriers in mountains and on lakes, simply because that was what victory required. And there were thousands more stories like this, waiting to be remembered.